Modern security is designed to keep people out, but it's useless against things that don't care about locks, walls, or the laws of physics. I thought I was safe inside my high-tech fortress until I realized that the shadows on my monitors weren't glitches, they were invitations. I work as a night shift security supervisor for one of the most prestigious private estates in the Pacific Northwest. The property is a sprawling 60-acre fortress of old-growth forest and modern architectural brilliance, owned by a billionaire who values privacy above all else. My post is the gatehouse, a reinforced glass and steel cube located at the primary entrance, nearly a mile away from the main mansion. It is a masterpiece of surveillance technology, equipped with 36 high-definition camera feeds, thermal imaging, motion sensors, and a direct line to the local police. For 3 years, the job was the definition of boredom until the night the forest decided to move. The shift started like any other. The sun dipped behind the towering Douglas firs, casting long, jagged shadows across the manicured lawns. I settled into my leather chair, surrounded by the hum of cooling fans and the soft glow of a dozen monitors. My task was simple: watch the screens, log the perimeter checks, and ensure the automated gates remain sealed. The estate is surrounded by a 10-foot electrified fence, making it one of the most secure locations in the country. Out here in the middle of nowhere, the only thing we usually caught on camera were deer or the occasional black bear. At exactly 2:14 a.m., a silent alarm triggered on the north perimeter. I leaned forward, pulling the feed onto the main screen. The north perimeter faces a dense, untouched section of the woods where the terrain is too steep for most people to navigate. The camera showed nothing but the gray, grainy shapes of trees in the infrared light. I checked the motion logs. Something had tripped the sensor, but whatever it was gone in a fraction of a second. I chalked it up to a falling branch or a bird and reset the alarm. 10 minutes later, the thermal sensor in the same sector began to flare. Thermal imaging doesn't lie. It picks up heat signatures, the bright white-hot glow of a living body, but what I saw on the screen made no sense. There was a heat signature, but it wasn't a solid shape. It looked like a cloud of glowing embers, a chaotic, shifting mass of heat that was moving along the fence line. It wasn't jumping the fence or cutting through it, it seemed to be pressed against it, sliding along the wire like liquid. I adjusted the contrast, trying to get a clearer image. As I watched, the mass stopped. It condensed into a tall, thin pillar of heat standing perfectly still. My heart began a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I picked up the radio to call the roaming patrol, but before I could press the button, the lights in the gatehouse flickered. The hum of the servers dropped an octave, and for a heartbeat, the room went pitch black. When the backup generators kicked in a second later, the atmosphere in the gatehouse had changed. The air felt heavy, charged with static, and smelled faintly of ozone and wet earth. I looked back at the monitors. The thermal mass was gone from the north perimeter. I frantically cycled through the cameras, my eyes darting from screen to screen. I found it on Cam 7, the camera mounted directly above the gatehouse entrance. The heat signature was no longer a cloud. It had taken a shape that was roughly human but far too elongated. It was standing on the roof of the gatehouse directly above me. I could hear it now, not the sound of footsteps, but a slow, rhythmic tapping on the reinforced glass skylight. Tap, tap, tap. It was the sound of a fingernail or perhaps a claw testing the strength of the pane. I looked up. The skylight was made of 3-inch thick, shatter-resistant glass. Through the dark tint, I couldn't see anything but the reflection of my own terrified face. But then a drop of something dark and oily hit the glass from the outside. Then another. It wasn't rain. It was a thick, black substance that seemed to eat the light around it. It began to seep into the microscopic pores of the glass, spreading like ink in water. I reached for my phone, but the screen was a mess of digital static. The rec icon on my main monitor began to blink rapidly, and the timestamp on the screen started counting backward. I was sitting in a $1 million security hub, surrounded by the best technology man could buy, and I realized with a sickening jolt of terror that I was completely defenseless. The tapping stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard a sound that didn't come from the roof, but from the monitors themselves. A low, distorted whisper filled the room, emerging from the high-end speakers. "You see us," the voice rasped, sounding like 1,000 dead leaves skittering across pavement. "Now let us in." I watched in horror as the first crack appeared in the center of the skylight. The reinforced glass, designed to stop a high-caliber bullet, was spiderwebbing inward, pushed by a force that shouldn't exist. I wasn't just watching a breach, I was watching the end of my reality. The sound of the glass cracking was a sharp, crystalline snap that resonated through the steel frame of the gatehouse like a gunshot. My high-tech sanctuary, a fortress designed to withstand intruders and the elements, felt suddenly as fragile as an eggshell. On the monitor, Cam 7 continued to show the distorted heat signature, a tall, flickering pillar of white-hot energy that shouldn't have been able to exist in the physical world. It remained perched on the roof, its fingers still pressed against the splintering skylight. Fear, cold and paralyzing, rooted me to the spot. I watched as the oily black substance seeping through the cracks began to drip onto the control console. Wherever it touched the high-end equipment, sparks flew and the smell of ozone intensified. One of my primary monitors flickered violently before dying entirely, leaving a void in the wall of screens. The voice from the speakers, that overlapping multi-tonal whisper, didn't stop. It began to recite my own name over and over in a rhythmic chant that felt like it was vibrating inside my skull. "How do you know my name?" I gasped, the sound of my own voice barely audible over the electronic screeching of the failing systems. The response was a sudden, violent thud on the roof that shook the entire structure. The cracks in the skylight expanded instantly, web-like fractures reaching the edges of the frame. I knew I had seconds before the glass gave way entirely. I lunged for my gear bag, my hands fumbling for the heavy tactical flashlight and my car keys. I didn't care about the billionaire's property or my professional duties anymore. The only thing that mattered was putting distance between myself and the entity on the roof. I threw myself toward the heavy steel door that led to the exterior. As I grabbed the handle, I glanced back at the thermal monitor one last time. What I saw stopped the breath in my lungs. The heat signature was no longer alone. Two more shifting, glowing masses had appeared on the edge of the gatehouse's thermal perimeter. They weren't coming from the woods. They were emerging directly out of the solid stone of the perimeter wall, as if they were walking through a doorway that only they could see. I shoved the door open and sprinted into the night. The air outside was freezing and thick with a mist that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. My car was parked only 20 feet away, but in the swirling fog it felt like miles. I could hear the glass of the skylight finally shattering behind me, a cascading roar of falling shards. I didn't look back. I reached the car, fumbled the key into the ignition, and the engine roared to life. As I threw the car into reverse, my headlights swept across the front of the gatehouse. The entity was standing in the doorway I had just exited. In the glare of the LEDs, it looked like a tear in the fabric of reality. A silhouette made of static and shadows, lacking any discernible features except for two pinpricks of dull, orange light where eyes should be. It didn't move like a human. It glided, its form lengthening and shortening with a sickening, liquid grace. I slammed the car into drive and floored it toward the main gate. The electronic gates were dead, stuck in their locked position due to the power failure. I didn't even tap the brakes. I rammed the heavy iron gates at 40 miles per hour. The sound of twisting metal and breaking glass was deafening, but the force was enough to burst the locks. I careened onto the main road, the car fishtailing as I fought for control. For miles, I drove with my foot pinned to the floor, my eyes locked on the rearview mirror. For a long time, there was nothing but the retreating glow of the estate's lights. But then, as I crested a hill, I saw a flash of white in the mirror. I checked the rear-facing dashcam monitor on my dashboard. On the screen, in the thermal overlay mode that was still active, a bright red heat signature was packing the car. It wasn't on the road. It was moving through the trees lining the highway, keeping perfect pace with a vehicle traveling at 80 miles per hour. It moved with a terrifying blurred speed, leaping over ravines and through dense brush without losing a second of ground. I realized then that the walls of the estate hadn't been built to keep people out. They were built to contain something, and I had just let it out into the world. The adrenaline was the only thing keeping my hands on the wheel as the needle on the speedometer climbed past 90. On my dashboard, the secondary thermal monitor, a feature of the car's high-end dashcam, was still displaying the nightmare. The bright red heat signature was leaping through the dense forest canopy with a terrifying, rhythmic grace, keeping perfect pace with my car. It wasn't running, it was gliding, a blur of impossible thermal energy that defied the laws of biology. Every time I glanced at the screen, it felt like the entity was getting closer to the edge of the asphalt, waiting for the perfect moment to cross the threshold. I finally reached the outskirts of a small mountain town, the first signs of streetlights and gas stations appearing like beacons of hope. As soon as I entered the radius of the town's power grid, the thermal signature on my monitor flickered and vanished. I didn't slow down until I reached a well-lit 24-hour diner. I parked right under the brightest light in the lot, my chest heaving, waiting for the sun to rise. I stayed there until the sky turned a pale, dusty blue, and the world began to wake up. I never went back to the estate. I sent my resignation via email from a public library claiming a family emergency. I didn't even go back for my final paycheck. I moved 2 states away, took a job in a sterile, windowless data center in the middle of a city, and tried to bury the memory of that night under the mundane details of a new life. I thought that by leaving the woods, I had left the shadow behind. I was wrong. A month after I moved into my new apartment, the glitches started again. It began with my smart home devices. My speakers would turn on in the middle of the night, emitting a low-frequency hum that sounded like 1,000 dead leaves skittering across pavement. My television would cycle through channels on its own, eventually landing on a screen of gray static that seemed to hum with that same multi-tonal whisper I had heard in the gatehouse. The breaking point came when I installed a basic security camera at my front door, a habit I couldn't seem to break. One evening, I received a notification on my phone. Motion detected at front door. I opened the app expecting a delivery or a neighbor. Instead, the screen showed a black and white infrared view of my hallway. Standing directly in front of my door was a tall, thin silhouette. It didn't have a face, just those two pinpricks of orange light reflecting the infrared beam. It wasn't trying to break in. It was just standing there, its long, spindly hand pressed against the wood of the door, exactly where the deadbolt was. I checked the timestamp on the video. The recording was from 10 minutes ago. I looked at the door, then back at the phone. Then I switched the camera view to the thermal overlay mode I had kept from my old security software. The screen turned a deep neon blue, but the area around my front door was glowing a brilliant, white-hot red. The heat wasn't just on the outside of the door. It was seeping through the wood, spreading across the floor of my entryway like a spilled liquid. The entity wasn't waiting for me to open the door. It was slowly vibrating through the physical matter of the building. I realized then what the billionaire owner of the estate had known all along. Those 60 acres of forest and the 10-foot electrified fence weren't there to protect his wealth. They were a containment field. The estate was a cage, and by breaking through those gates in my blind terror, I hadn't just escaped, I had acted as the key. Now I live in a world of constant light. I sleep with every lamp in the apartment turned on. I've covered my mirrors and my windows with reflective film, but I can still hear the tapping. It's not on the glass anymore, it's coming from inside the walls. Tap, 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 a rhythmic, patient sound. They aren't in a hurry. They've waited centuries in the deep woods, and now they have the whole world to explore. Every time a light flickers or a monitor glitches, I know they are just a few vibrations away. The walls were never a lie because they were strong. They were a lie because they gave us the illusion that we were the ones in control. Now, the shadow is out, and it's learned how to follow the wires home.